In this video, we're going to review the cell cycle, mitosis and meiosis. It's important to remember that the cell cycle is made up of 4 different phases. There's G1, S phase, G2, and then mitosis. Most of the cell's life is actually spent in the first 3 phases, G1, S, G2, which is basically the cell getting ready to divide. And then we have mitosis, or cell division. G1 phase is the period when the cell grows and develops. The cell needs to get bigger before it splits, or else if you split a normal sized cell in 2, you'd end up with 2 really small cells. S phase is known as synthesis phase. This is when DNA replication occurs. Synthesize just means to make. We've used that word a couple times, and so DNA basically has to copy itself. The first time we learned about S phase, we hadn't talked about DNA yet, or about DNA replication. But at this point, you should know what DNA replication is. We're going to review that later this week. But it's important to realize S phase is when replication is occurring. And the last phase before mitosis occurs is G2. G2 is basically when organelles, like centrioles, that are essential for cell division are made. The other thing you might need to know for MCAS is that G1, S, G2 are the 3 phases that make up interphase. Mitosis is not part of interphase. Important vocab that we learned when we were talking about cell division was sister chromatids. So it's important to be able to look at a chromosome, and remember a chromosome is an entire X, and identify its different parts. Each leg is a sister chromatid, and remember the center is called the centromere. The other important thing we need to remember is the term somatic cell. A somatic cell is any cell in your body that's not a sex cell. Somatic cells are diploid, which means they have 2 copies of each chromosome, one that you get from your mom and one from your dad. In mitosis, which we're about to talk about, somatic cells get made. We're also will talk about meiosis that makes sex cells. Now that we've reviewed those vocab terms, we can start talking about mitosis. Mitosis is the process of making new cells. Again, we're making somatic cells. And you need to make new cells for a couple reasons. One is whenever you're growing, you're adding cells to your body. And 2 is to replace the old cells, maybe that die off, or maybe that just need replacing. Now we can start talking about the phases. The first phase of mitosis is called prophase. This is the longest phase, and a lot happens. Chromosomes appear, so before prophase, you don't have these little tightly coiled X's of DNA. Your DNA is just loose. You also have centrioles are going to move to opposite ends of a cell. So centrioles can be found anywhere before mitosis starts, but they need to go to opposite ends. And then you have spindle fibers attaching to the chromosomes. The nucleus disappears, and you no longer have the DNA stuck inside. So by the end of prophase, this is what your cell should look like. You should have these centrioles on opposite sides. You should have spindle fibers attaching onto the chromosomes, and you should notice that there is no nuclear envelope, meaning there is no defined nucleus. Then we go on to metaphase. This is a short phase where chromosomes line up across the middle of a cell. So metaphase, think middle. So far we've had prophase, then metaphase. Anaphase, this is when sister chromatids split apart. So the 2 sides of the X kind of turn into 2 different V's, and they start to move towards opposite ends of the cell. And finally we come to telophase. Telophase is when we start to see the cells dividing. So instead of it looking like one oval, you can start to see where 2 cells are going to form. and that's the last phase of mitosis. One way to remember those phases in order is to remember the terms PMAP, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And that sums up mitosis. Now we'll quickly review meiosis. Meiosis is the process of making sex cells. You will most likely not be asked the phases of meiosis, but there are a couple key things we do need to go over to get you ready for the test. The first is just to keep in mind that when we're talking about sex cells, we're talking about egg and sperm. And those cells are made in meiosis. The second key concept that takes place in meiosis is that of crossing over. Remember that crossing over happens when two chromosomes, one from your mom and one from your dad, line up next to each other during meiosis. Part of one chromosome breaks off and switches with part of another. The major reason crossing over is important is because it accounts for a lot of the genetic diversity. Otherwise, your parents would really only have two options for what genes they could pass on to you. That could result in two siblings looking identical. But because you can get a mixture of your parents' genes, now all of a sudden there's a lot of variation or diversity in what someone can look like. If crossing over is a concept you don't really remember, make sure to ask questions about it. The next important thing to think about for the MCAS is about fertilization. So through the process of meiosis, we make egg and sperm cells. Then, through the process of fertilization, the egg cell comes together with the sperm cell. Their DNA combines, and you end up with something called a zygote. This zygote will actually then undergo many mitotic cell divisions until it has developed into an embryo and eventually a baby. On the MCAS, you might be asked to compare and contrast meiosis and mitosis. And there are 4 key differences that you want to keep in mind. One is that mitosis only divides once, whereas meiosis has 2 phases, or divides twice. The second thing to remember is that mitosis, only dividing once, results in 2 cells, whereas meiosis results in 4 cells. Mitosis is making somatic cells, and meiosis is only making egg and sperm, or sex cells. And lastly, mitosis is making diploid cells, while meiosis makes haploid. Remember that in humans, diploid cells contain 46 chromosomes and haploid contain 23. At this point, you should feel confident with the cell cycle, mitosis and meiosis. But if you don't, you should make sure to ask questions before filling in your review packet or while filling in your review packet.